Welcome everyone, and first I would like to thank Priscilla Hunley for inviting Professor Perkins here to speak at Newbury Court. We tried to get him here a few months ago, and it was a little back and forth, but he's finally here, and we're thrilled. We're being filmed today on Channel 8 for the Concord cable station, so thank you, Betsy, for doing that. Appreciate it. You can see the lecture again on the cable station, CCTV Channel 8. Our speaker today, Dwight Perkins, is the Harold Hitchings Burbank Professor of Political Economy Emeritus at Harvard. His previous positions at Harvard include Associate Director of the East Asian Research Center, which is now the Fairbank Center for Chinese Studies. He was the Chairman of the Department of Economics, Director of the Harvard Institute for International Development, and Director of the Harvard Asia Center. Dwight Perkins has co-authored, or edited 24 books and over 100 articles on economic history and economic development of China and other Asian and developing economies. He has served as a consultant advisor to the governments in Vietnam, the Republic of Korea, Indonesia, Malaysia, China, Papua New Guinea, as well as to the U.S. government, the Ford Foundation, and the World Bank. Please welcome Professor Dwight Perkins.
Well, thank you, Jesse. What I'm going to, I can't even remember what my title was, but never mind. What I'm going to try to do today is first to go through and give you a sense, something you already know to a large degree, which is the degree to which there was a fundamental change in China, for the most part, at least in the economic sphere, in a positive direction over the last 38 or 9 years. And then I want to get up to the present, and I want to talk a bit about how dramatic, in many ways, the changes in the present are and what they have implied for the U.S. situation. The president, of course, being the shift in power to Xi Jinping, which actually happened 6 years ago, but particularly in the last 2 years or so, the Xi Jinping decision to go in a very different direction from the way China had gone over nearly the whole 40 years before that. But first, I want to remind you just how dramatic the changes have been over this 40-year period. China was a very poor agricultural economy in 1978-79 when the this reform period started. Per capita income was $300. Today it is $9,000. That's the exchange rate. If you like to use purchasing power parity, that gives you a little better idea of the standard of living. It was $600 in 1978-79. It's $16,000 today. And while there are, this is not a totally equal growth, nevertheless, everybody has prospered. There are almost no people that are down below the $2 a day standard that the World Bank and others use for measuring the extreme poverty. All but maybe 1% of China is in that category, and they're gradually getting rid of that. Furthermore, back then, as I say, 18% of the population was in the cities. Today, 57%, according to official statistics, is in the city. But if you know anything about rural China today, 90% of the people under the age of 40 may be registered in the rural towns. They are actually working in the cities, and because of the peculiarities of the Chinese registration system, they have to maintain their residence and often their children back in the countryside, but they're all working in the cities. So the actual level of urbanization in terms of employment is even higher than the 57%. So there's been this huge change, but it's been a steady, gradual change, and at least in the economic sphere, in a pretty steady pattern toward abandoning the Soviet-type centrally planned command system and moving to a full market system. But the Soviet system that China adopted in really in the mid-1950s, basically in the industrial and urban areas, the only markets are for some consumer goods, and even those are mostly rationed, the most important ones. Factories are basically get their goods allocated to them by a central plan. They don't go buy them on the market. Prices, frankly, don't matter much in this context. Even in the countryside, you have collectivized agriculture. Individual households do not farm. The units that collective units have varied in size, but in the 1970s, early 70s, the typical, no one owned their land. 5% of the land was allowed. You could have private plots on. The rest of it was farmed collectively with the group. That's the system that existed, and that's the system that got steadily dismantled beginning in 1979 and 1980. In the 1980s, the two big changes were first getting rid of collective agriculture and going back to household agriculture. This was actually a bottom-up move more than a top-down move, but Deng Xiaoping, whenever the party officials afraid of what was happening as people were going back automatically toward household agriculture, party officials thinking about stopping it, Deng Xiaoping would step in and basically tell them, just keep it going, don't stop it. And by 1983, 84, there were no more collective farms in China, basically. The next big change was in 84. They finally allowed some goods, industrial goods, to be sold on the market. And increasingly, firms, if they above their planned quota, could sell on the market. And the idea was they were going to make the state enterprises, and all the enterprises were owned by the state. There were no private industrial enterprises this time. Basic idea was that the state enterprises would become more efficient if you had this market. In fact, it didn't work very well that way. But what happened was, once you actually allowed goods to be sold on the market, industrial inputs to be sold on the market, the beneficiaries were all of the rural industries that had grown up under the previous commune system, and they began to boom. And in fact, they were increasingly behaving like private enterprises, although technically they were called collectives. But these industrial enterprises were the boom in industry in the 80s and into the early 90s was mostly in these small and medium scale enterprises on the edges of cities and in the countryside. So that was the 80s. It, of course, ended in a way. It's also, by the way, the period of the freest speaking, in terms of saying anything you really wanted to say. I mean, you could criticize all the past. You had to be somewhat circumspect when you talked about Mao Zedong. You had to follow the line, which was that he was 2/3 good, but 1/3 made big mistakes. But generally speaking, it was a very open system. It's a system at a time when I got involved personally and very heavily in trying to transform the way economics was taught in China, and it was effectively changed from a Marxist political economy system to a modern market economy system over a period of about 15 years. The June 4th, 1989, of course, is the student demonstrations and the army coming in and killing probably 700 or 800 of them. A brief reaction, conservative reaction. Deng Xiaoping then makes a trip to the south, says that the reforms are good, As one friend of mine at the time in China said to me at the time, the good news is Deng Xiaoping has said that reforms are good, and so we're back. We can go back to discussing reforms and keep on going with reforms in 1992. The bad news is we had to wait for Deng Xiaoping to say it before we could do anything about it. But anyway, 1992, then you get the expansion of market forces in industry, but you get really the first development in terms of large-scale foreign companies coming in with foreign direct investment. Basically, by the early 90s, China had developed enough of a legal system. I don't want to overstate the case. You would not want to have been in a criminal trial in China, and then you wouldn't want to be one now either. But but in terms of where was I? In basic, the legal systems for the foreign direct investment were for things like tax law and things and the like, and you began to get tens of billions of dollars coming in from foreign corporations. Today, you're getting at a little over $100 billion a year of foreign direct investment pouring into China, and that's been going on now for 30 years. Probably more important is that this is the period when the Prime Minister was Zhu Rongji, and Prime Minister Zhu Rongji was one of the real reformers in China. And one of the things he really set out to do in the 1990s, first as Deputy Prime Minister and then as Prime Minister, was to really try to make the state enterprises behave. Try to make them behave like according to market forces, and not rely on their political connections, not rely on massive subsidies from the state banks, which were effectively bankrupting the banks. And the problem was how to bring pressure, because these state enterprises had a lot of political power of their own. And while he had political power, he was the prime minister, he wasn't the head of the Politburo, he wasn't the chairman of the Communist Party, he wasn't, who was also the president of the country, Jiang Zemin at that time. So the question was how to do it, and one of the key ways he did it was he basically said, we need more competition from abroad. And so basically he went and said, we need to get China to join the World Trade Organization. Now, up until that point, China had been negotiating to join the World Trade Organization while it was expanding its exports. But it had all kinds of conditions on what it would make it be willing to join the World Trade Organization. Conditions, the gist of which was, well, we're a developing country, we need to be able to do protection, we need to be able to do all these other violations of WTO rules. Well, Zhu Rongji decided that that basically, from now on, we need these imports coming in and competing with the domestic state firms in order to discipline them. And the only way we're going to get it is if we do join the WTO. And he used the WTO joining as a threat to the state enterprises. Either you shape up or you're going to get wiped out by the foreign multinationals coming in. That was his goal. So he went to Washington. He met with President Clinton and Bob Rubin, who was then the Secretary of the Treasury. And he basically said, okay, we've been saying we wouldn't do this, we wouldn't do that, we needed these exceptions. Forget all that. We accept all of your conditions. We aren't going to argue about any of them. We just accept the U.S. position, which was a pretty forceful. You've got to basically take on the standard rules of all the high-income countries. And Clinton and Rubin thought about it for a bit, I guess. But anyway, they then said to him, "Gee, that's a generous offer, but we don't think we can get it through Congress." and therefore we probably won't be able to go ahead with negotiations for you to join the WTO now. Zhurongji then went out to Denver, and he gave a speech to, I don't know whether it was 500 or 1,000 businessmen, but a lot of them. And basically he gave a speech that spelled out exactly what he'd offered Clinton. And the phones to the White House started ringing, and I mean hundreds of them. The businessmen coming and saying, "Are you crazy? This is the best deal you could possibly get. Why aren't you going ahead?" By the time that Zhurongji came back to Boston, Clinton had changed his mind and they began the negotiations for joining the WTO. And they did join the WTO. And it did have the effect. In fact, Zhurongji took the political risk of actually forcing the state enterprises to reduce their workforces by 50 million people, which is a pretty risky thing to do. But anyway, so you get to the 90s, and then you get into past the year 2000, and you basically are continuing with a steady move toward a market system, full market system for almost everything. You still have the state enterprises. There's no outright privatization, but all of these small-scale industries that were in the countryside that were called collective are all privatized. Basically, they become private enterprises. The private sector becomes important. The most important, and then you get to the 13th Party Congress, which is about 2013, and the party congresses meet every 5 years, and they're when the government states sort of the fundamental goals for the next 5 years or so, and in this case, the goals were we need to complete the move to a market economy. And they came up with a list of 60 different reforms, about 35 or 40 of which were related to the economy, and the others related to other aspects of society. The primary author of this is probably a man named Liu He, who was at that time a member of the Central Committee. He is today a member of the Politburo. He's also a Kennedy School graduate. I realize I think most of you have MIT connections, or at least a lot of you do. But nevertheless, he got at least 1 year's good education at the Kennedy School. And basically, at that point, you can say that that China was really completing the process. They still hadn't made up their mind what they were going to do with state enterprises. But even in the state enterprises, they said they were going to force them to meet competition, and they were going to have to behave like market-oriented, and not really all that different from modern corporations around the world. That's what the situation was then, and for the next 2 or 3 years, you at least could argue that China was really still moving steadily toward a market system. I'll talk about some other non-economic aspects of that when I compare to what has changed. Then about 2 years ago, 2.5 years ago, things began to change. I at the time did not fully recognize it, but when you get to the 19th Party Congress, which was a little over a year ago now, and the 19th Party Congress fundamentally shifts the policy. Xi Jinping comes in with the 13th Party Congress. The 14th Party Congress, Xi Jinping is fully in charge. He's run an anti-corruption campaign that is very popular, which he's also used to get rid of all the people who opposed him, in addition to actually getting rid of a lot of corruption. So some of the fancy meals that people were being offered and so on by local officials got a lot less fancy for a while. But then, as I say, with the 19th Party Congress, this is when he announces that, or he gets the party to pass that he no longer has this restriction of just two 5-year terms for the president and the party secretary. He can go on now forever if he so desires. But the basic thing is, they say, state enterprises are going to be the center of what we do. So in economic affairs, we're now back. State enterprises have to be strengthened. They have to expand their role. The private sector is still necessary. Foreign trade is still necessary. But the leading forces in our economy are the public sector. Furthermore, in the private sector, all private sector firms have party committees. Now, that is not new. They've always had Communist Party committees including the private firms and the foreign firms and so on. That's the way the communist system works. I helped set up a program in Vietnam called the Fulbright Economic Teaching Program, which is now part of what is the Fulbright University of Vietnam, which was sort of come up through it. And we had a party committee, but it only had one person, and he was a member of the faculty, and he took orders from the rest of the faculty. And we had better connections with the party than he did, so. Anyway, but so, you know, in a sense, in the day before 2 or 3 years ago, the party committees were not a problem. You could run your own company. The foreigners' companies and so on did not have to worry about party. Now the party committee is everywhere. The party committee is in the private firms, and it sits on the management board. I mean, everything you do basically is passed through. And when you get down to the universities, again, in the fields of, say, economics, which I know best, for a long period, really from the middle of the 1990s right up until 2 or 3 years ago, essentially when you taught economics, you taught modern economics. The students had to take some Marxist political economy or history of China seen through communist eyes and so on. But generally speaking, the departments of economics were free to pretty much teach the way they taught when they were in graduate school at Harvard or MIT or wherever. And then all of a sudden, the party committees are now there. They sit on the curriculum discussions. There is an effort to push a lot more Marxist political economy back into the curriculum. And partly because, at least I think there are people that study these things more than I have the stomach for, think that we have read most of Xi Jinping's works and are convinced that Xi Jinping really does believe in Marxist-Leninist theory and sort of the contradictions and the Hegelian thesis and antithesis way of thinking about problems. And but to maintain political stability, to maintain control of the government, he feels it's essential that everybody to some degree become a Marxist again. In a society that up until this point, Marxist-Leninism among the universities was something that was that the students sat through the classes, but frankly, most of them were not very much interested, and they were all interested in doing modern economics or modern political science or whatever. Now you have also much more observation of the teaching of the faculty, and the faculty is also, when they don't toe the line in certain areas, they get spoken to, and if they go too far, they are risking their jobs. So you've had this, as I say, you have this 38-9-year period of a straight move toward a market economy and the intellectual support for it in the way that the universities were teaching and the like. And it spilled over not only to economics, but it was also true. I mean, it was somewhat more constraints in political science and sociology and so on, whereas under the previous communist period, it feels like sociology weren't even allowed. And then you get this change. And the problem is you get the change in a situation where you're not just changing the role of the party. Xi Jinping also basically decides at this time that China was going to go out and become much more assertive in its international policies. Deng Xiaoping's foreign policy, other than in the early years when I was traveling there, began traveling there, the Chinese foreign policy was very anti-Soviet. And in fact, U.S. foreign policy and Chinese foreign policy were about the same. If it helped the Soviet Union, they were against it. If it hurt them, they were for it. That, of course, has changed dramatically. But the basic of Deng Xiaoping's view is we are going to lay low. We are going to be quiet. We're just going to build our strength over time, and we can worry about being assertive in international relations and things like that at a later time when we're ready and we have the power and so on. Well, Xi Jinping has decided that China has the power. This is the time to move, and so you're getting much more vigorous assertions in terms of, I mean, the South China Sea gets the most publicity. You're getting much more vigorous movements against Taiwan. It's still mostly rhetoric, but not entirely. And then you're getting, for example, the extradition treaty in Hong Kong. Hong Kong was supposed to be left alone for 50 years. And the extradition treaty, you can say, well, what's so big deal about that? Well, the answer is it's a big deal because anybody then can be extradited to mainland and be tried in the mainland from Hong Kong, whereas today they can't. And now they do occasionally get kidnapped and taken to the mainland, but generally speaking, Hong Kong has been a fairly free part. So increased party role, increased assertiveness, the mixed feelings about, sometimes positively helpful in things like North Korea, sometimes not so positively with regard. You're also getting, the freedom of speech within China. Let me back up. In the 1970s and 60s, China was a true totalitarian society. In the following sense. I've made my first trip to China in 1974, but I was with a U.S. senator and we were mostly talking to Deng Xiaoping and Chao Guanhua, so I didn't learn what the society was really about then because they could speak their mind. But in 75, I led a delegation to look at rural industry, and we were accompanied by the 2 or 3 economists with us. And then we were meeting with various factory people and some political people all along the way. In 1970s, you could not be alone with a single Chinese ever. There always had to be someone else there who could report on what you said. I gave what passed for a lecture on the U.S. economy at Fudan University. A woman I could only give it to the faculty and then to only 5 or 6 members. The woman who had gotten her degree in, I've forgotten, chemistry, I think, at MIT, and was later a member of the Chinese Communist Party Central Committee and president of Fudan University, one of the 2 or 3 best universities in China. We were walking along talking, and just talking about Cambridge and back Cambridge when she was in school and so on. Every minute or two she had to turn to the party secretary and explain what we were talking about. And I mean, this was a person who had plenty of influence and stuff. Essentially, you could not, when I was in the small-scale industry delegation, I was, because I was head of the delegation, I was with the Chinese head for on the average of 6 or 8 hours a day. We had a car and everyone else was in a van, which was a problem because the car dust and the van had to eat dust. But anyway, that's neither here nor there. That's not relevant to the talk. I had these long discussions with him trying to explain why we were interested. In that 30 days, he never said a single word that could not have been safely printed on the front page of the People's Daily. He was totally constrained and when I gave him a discussion of why we were asking about prices so much, and when we visited the factories, after listening to a 2 or 3 hour explanation, he said, profits. And then he made sure that somebody went ahead to every factory he went to and make sure they didn't answer any questions about prices, because profits were not proper in the Maoist culture. This was a society where there was really no freedom of speech of any kind whatsoever, even among, I mean, even within families, it was dangerous. The situation you get now is that you're increasingly moving back. I don't want to overstate the case. You're not moving anywhere near back toward that. That was a true totalitarian society. Everybody was afraid to speak their mind in almost all circumstances. Today, there's still, if you go to a conference in China on environmental matters or technical matters, you can have a pretty freewheeling discussion. In private, you still have lots of private conversations with your friends and so on and so forth. But in terms of if you're not careful and you have your conversation where somebody who is in authority or has some police role overhears it, it can cause great trouble for you. Furthermore, you have the great firewall that now makes it very difficult to get all kinds of information on the internet. Google, of course, has never been allowed into China, so you have Baidu, and Baidu is very carefully censored. They literally have hundreds of thousands of people now censoring the internet. And censoring all the WeChat and so on and so forth. They now have this little game which you play and you get points, and the points are all, do you get the right answers to the various questions? And they're all political type questions. They're not quite as bad as what I'm about to say, but what do you think of Xi Jinping thought? Well, obviously the answer to that is it's wonderful, and so on. So it's an attempt to really push a quite strong ideological tenor to it. They are trying to prevent, Xi Jinping has tried to prevent the use of too many foreign textbooks. He's trying to make it so that China only uses, as wherever possible, Chinese textbooks that are written properly, and so on. And then you have, in terms of extreme human rights, you have, of course, the Uyghurs in northwest China, the Muslims that are basically in concentration camps, at least more than 1 million of them, and under very, very tight control because China doesn't trust them to not work against the country. Now, into this same world, as China is moving in this direction, we all decided to elect Donald Trump. And so you have, and I'm going to end with just a brief discussion of the trade issue, because it's the most obvious and most immediate issue. China, the one area where China is still interested in maintaining more or less the system as it was, is in the trade sphere and to some degree the foreign investment sphere. They want open trading, they want free trading. But of course China has been violating the spirit of this in many ways. Their willingness to stay with WTO rules has been, shall we say, less than perfect, although not as bad perhaps as the current administration says. Now, Trump comes into this situation, and he has a view that he's held now for over 20 years. His view is, and he didn't develop this as a political game or something, or some maneuver. This is something he talked about 20 years ago. And the basic of it is that trade deficits are bad, and trade deficits with a country, bilateral trade deficits between the US and China, between the US and anybody else, are because the other side's cheating. He deeply believes that. Now, he went to Wharton. He must have missed the macroeconomic lectures, or he forgot them. Bilateral trade deficits are meaningless. They are politically significant because most people think that, yeah, there's probably some truth to it. The reason we have a deficit is because our guys aren't competing properly, or because people are cheating us and doing and keeping an undervalued exchange rate or whatever. The reality is we have a large trade deficit overall because we don't save enough. We spend more than we produce. And when you do that, you're going to have a deficit. And in fact, the biggest contributor to the deficit over the last 2 or 3 years has been the tax cut, the Republican tax cut. A tax cut automatically feeds right into the trade deficit, and in fact, our trade deficit is now larger than it was before this, and the trade deficit with China has also increased. And Trump had people who were actually explaining this to him in his administration, and most of them are gone now. So there is, however, another part to the trade negotiations which is not as indefensible as that particular point of view, and that is the issue that China, particularly the issue that China has been using trade to basically force technology, various methods to force technology transfer. Outright stealing through cyber activities of various kinds, conducted by the Army in many cases, and then, feeding commercial information to favored firms in China that can then compete, use the technology. Opening the market for many firms only to those firms that are willing to share their technology, and so on. That's a violation of WTO rules, but nevertheless, China has done it a lot. And Mr. Lighthizer, who is the negotiator of this, that's been a major theme in a lot of the negotiations. And that problem is a real problem, and it's one that, frankly, is going to not go away if Mr. Trump is not re-elected. If the Democrats are elected, it's not going to get much better in terms of trade relationships with China, because the unions are probably the single most determined to do something about China trade, and they don't really like free trade at all. in terms of the cyber thing, the Obama administration actually had a negotiation with China to get them to curb the use of this for commercial purposes. Now, one should preface this by pointing out that everybody uses cyber methods in order to steal secrets from the other countries. The United States does it big time. China does it. Britain does it. The US does it. But it's for military and security purposes. So when you're going to actually have a negotiation, as Obama did, you have to basically sit down and say, okay, we got to draw a line. The commercial purposes are out. You can't use it that way. You can't get it from, but we know we're all going to cheat and spy on each other for military and security purposes. And in fact, the Chinese basically agreed to that. But of course, then you get into the question of, okay, what's security and what's not? And in fact, a friend, acquaintance of mine that I know was saying that we were getting down to whether the Chinese were arguing that a particular color of paint was a security issue. And anyway, that's the level at which you have to deal with this issue. Anyway, so we have, therefore, a situation where China is now, where we've spent 30 or 40 years trying to get China fully involved with the international system. Today, the US policy is to decouple from China. And furthermore, it's Xi Jinping's policy, to some degree, to decouple from the rest of the world. And so we're in a war, a trade war, but it's really much broader than a trade war that is going to go on probably for a very long time, hopefully with more skill than the current administration seems capable of mounting, but it's not going to change very much going forward. And I think at that point I should leave some time for questions. Yeah. Okay, so are you going to hand that around? Yeah, okay.
Where would you envision China and the U.S. relationship? What would it look like in the next 5 to 10 years? How do you view China moving forward? And what the effect is on us?
The trade war is not going to stop growth in either country, although it's a little hard to be sure about that because the actual trade issues, the tariffs, will lower the GDP of both the U.S. and of China, but not by a big amount. The trade just isn't, and it's probably a little worse for China than for the U.S. So the problem in terms of the world economy is whether it feeds into uncertainty for investors, and then you begin to get decisions by investors not to invest, and then you begin to sort of head toward a recession. And that, to some degree, could happen in China as well, although the government has, in the past, always stepped in with massive infrastructure building programs and so on to offset that. But China's growth could slow down. The U.S. could go into recession. So that's one possibility. I don't, so far, if I knew the real answer to that, I'd be working on the market now and seeing what I have no idea what is going to happen in that regard. I think the one constant here is I don't see any change in Xi Jinping's policy. I think that is, this is a direction he's going. He would like to see the U.S. pushed much further away from China so that he doesn't, as it is now, we can't put carriers anywhere near China in terms of, if we actually got into a war in the Taiwan Straits, our carriers would have to be several hundred miles out beyond Taiwan. going through the Taiwan Straits would be suicide with the Chinese. The Chinese military has been building steadily. Now, at one level, that was always going to happen. China was going to become more and more powerful, and ultimately it was going to probably get to a point where it equals the U.S. So military, are we going to go to war? No, because at least not. I can't imagine that they're going to actually attack Taiwan, but there are a lot of other ways you can make life in Taiwan miserable. Taiwan would be the thing that would lead to war, but because we say we are going to defend Taiwan, how we would do that is a real issue. So China is not going to change. Trade issues, the Democrats aren't that different. Trade issues, the Democrats do have better economists, at least, than Lawrence Kudlow and the like. But the fact is the political positions of the Democratic Party are very much toward China, not all that different from, say, the Leithizer positions. So then you get exchange. Will exchanges continue? Yes. Well, just to give you though, but again, the exchanges have been cut way back. Harvard used to have the Ash Institute, the Kennedy School used to train 60 provincial leaders, high level. Every year, the 60 of them, they would spend 3 weeks at Tsinghua University, partly with Harvard and partly with Tsinghua faculty. They bring them to the Kennedy School for 3 weeks. And various people lectured the regular courses, and I lectured to them and various others. But and they traveled around the U.S. a bit. That program was first cut back by Xi Jinping and then totally abolished. The only exchanges that are going to be allowed are those that are actually officially negotiated by government to government, and there are not going to be very many of those. So again, Xi Jinping is trying to decouple. I think I don't see that changing fundamentally. There's still going to be a lot of exchanges because there's a lot of contact between individuals. I've had 4 invitations to go to China this year. I happened to turn them all down, but because I can't figure out what I want to say. But I think we're in sort of for what is some kind of a low-level Cold War for at least the next 5 years. Is that? Do you want to? So, somebody come up with a cheerful question or something?
I'm afraid this isn't that cheerful, but what is the relationship currently between Xi and Putin? I saw a headline that Xi was calling Putin his new best friend. Now, I don't believe headlines, but what's going on between the two countries?
At the moment, they have very similar foreign policy interests. They both resent pressures to change their system. It's different kinds of pressures. Putin is actually directly lopping off pieces of his neighbors, from his point of view, former parts of the Soviet Union that should be part of Russia. So it's not the same, but they also don't like, they're both highly authoritarian systems. They believe that authoritarian systems are the preferred system for their countries. And obviously they don't like the challenge. As of the moment, the Chinese are clearly more. They aren't more powerful in an Armageddon sense of who would, if the two went to war, who would win? Sort of says, well, everybody'd be dead, so including us, but because it would be a nuclear war. But But the Russians, in that sense, have more power than China. But basically, there aren't any real major border issues. There are a lot of fundamental issues that the Russians are, I'm sure, deeply suspicious of, because historically they've been deeply suspicious of China, and China has been deeply suspicious of Russia. And so you get the Central Asian republics, the various stands, if you like, that the Chinese are moving in on and establishing very close relationships, and those were part of the Soviet Union, and those would be seen as sort of pushing into Russian areas of influence, and so there's a potential for problems down the road, but right now the biggest problem for both of them is the United States.
I gather that one of the few foreign policy issues on which we are pretty much in agreement with our traditional allies is attitudes, concerns about China. How much practical difference is that likely to make in the sort of quasi-trade, but really more than trade struggles between the two countries?
Repeat the question, please.
Yes, the question is, we are on the same page. I mean, the United States is on the same page these days as the Europeans and the Japanese in terms of trade with China. Some of China's behavior vis-a-vis trade, and we that we oppose, but also the Europeans oppose. I mean, the cyber efforts to steal technology and pressures of that sort. The Europeans feel very strongly on that, as do we. Japanese maybe a little less so, but still they're probably more toward us. I think we're on the same wavelength, except that, this is one where actually some other kind of administration would be a big help. One that actually thinks that having allies is a good thing, and when you go into a negotiation with using tariffs, you don't at the same time go and do the same thing to the EU or threaten to do the same thing to the EU, Mexico, and everyone else under the sun, because you think tariffs are fun to play with, or they're powerful or something. This is a case where much more normal, whether a Republican or Democrat administration that believed in allies, really wanted to have allies, would be much more effective in dealing with China and Iran and so on and so forth than the current methods. But we have another year and a half at least of this administration. Yeah.
Maybe related to that, but the investments that China seems to be making, particularly in Africa, and basically more so in Latin America, South America particularly, there's probably a short game and a long game going on with them, trade and infrastructure. But how does that sort of tie in with the
so-called Belt and Road or BRI initiative, you'd have to study the details far more than I have to come with an overall appraisal of the African and Latin American cases. I have much more familiarity with some of the Asian cases of this. this effort is partly simply an effort by the Chinese to use this enormous construction capacity they built up to build housing. Well, something I didn't mention last. The average person in 1978 lived had a family of 3, lived in about a 200 square feet of space. Today, they live in whatever is 100 square meters, 1,000 square feet, more or less. And that was a major contraction. They also built, for those of you who have traveled to China, they now have a magnificent highway system. They have a magnificent high-speed trains. Well, the problem is they built all that, and now they have all this capacity. And so a lot of what they're doing is using it elsewhere. And the way in which they've done it has sometimes alienated, because their typical way in which they do it is they bring in not only the designers and the money and in fact, they don't bring the money. You have to, they lend you the money, and then they bring in all the laborers to do it. And they finally begun to learn in Africa that you can't do that and maintain a good relationship, so you've got to use local labor and things like that. But the issue that I have a fairly clear view in terms of Southeast Asia, but I have much less clear vis-a-vis Africa and Latin America, is how much of this is serving Chinese foreign policy interests as contrasted to development in these countries. And in Southeast Asia, to take one of the more extreme examples, I happen to do a lot of work in Malaysia still, and the original deal with Malaysia that they signed with Najib Razak, the former prime minister, was to build this east-west rail and a port facility and so on. And the deal was, I think, something like $12 billion. The Mahathir government came in and said, this is way too expensive, we're not going to do it. They rejected it, but then they renegotiated, and for essentially the same deal, they negotiated down to an $8 billion price. Now, why the difference? The difference is the $4 billion was a case where Najib Razak was trying to refinance the government organization, the government fund that he had raided for his own purposes, and why he ended up with somebody transferring $800 million or $1 billion into his personal bank account. He was basically going to use that. That was going to be a kickback that he would then use to refinance that. Well, more seriously, if you look at in Myanmar, where the pipeline and the road is going, and the new port is, it's very much geared to supplying China to Yunnan province, but it's a long way from anything that would actually benefit where most of the potential trade of Myanmar would be. And then you look at Pakistan, where they've built this huge corridor, which now has to be, because they built it in the most unstable part of Pakistan, Baluchistan, which is full of people that would like to get rid of Pakistan as well as the Chinese. And so you need tens of thousands of troops to defend it, and these are, of course, building ports that also serve the need of China to have to avoid the Malacca Straits and things of that sort, which is a bottleneck where much of their oil passes through. So it's a bit of a mixed bag, and a lot of the corruption in the system, I think, and some of the overlending, is that you have these big state enterprises that are used to a fair level of corruption. It's not all of it just government policy. So in sorting all that out, there are people in this country that are trying to do it, but so far we don't really yet. I don't have a clear picture of how much of it. Some of it is clearly benefiting Africa and clearly benefiting Latin America. How much of it is really just trying to control certain kinds of natural resource assets that the Chinese want, and so on, I don't know. So that's